Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Gonna wait a few more seconds and then we will get started. Thank you all for being here. Well, happy Tuesday, everyone. Hello and welcome. My name is Zami Tinashe Hemingway, and I am the Capacity Building Assistant CBA Gender Affirming Project Manager with Denver Prevention Training Center. If everyone could please change their name to the first and last name that you registered under so that we can take attendance, that would be great. In addition to changing your name, if you could include your pronouns so that we can honor everyone here in the room, that would also be very appreciated. So thank you again for coming to our COP today. I want to briefly share more information for folks who may be joining us for the first time. As part of Denver PTC's CBA funding, we are providing technical assistance in the West region to CDC directly funded community-based organizations and their clinical partners to address social determinants of health, gender affirming and integrated services, and delivery of status neutral services for transgender and gender expansive people. We work closely with 15 jurisdictions in the West to collaboratively provide services for transgender people in alignment with the Ending the HIV Epidemic initiative. If you are not directly funded organization, we can and will be happy to provide TA support to you as well. Please email me at zami.hemingway@dhha.org for additional information. Thank you again for being here for our part one of a two-part series. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Callan and Jordan to start the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zami. I appreciate that introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome this morning. I think we're all on morning time still, or most of us at least. Really appreciate you joining us for the first part of this two-part series that's going to be discussing legal transition as well as its intersection with HIV prevention and care. So for some of you, this may be an entirely new topic, and for others, it may be all too familiar. But wherever you're at on that scale, I'm really excited that you're here, and I hope that you'll participate in today's discussion to whatever degree you feel comfortable. We're going to be covering a lot of ground between our two sessions, and so I'm going to save some time at the end to specifically go over questions, but I also want you to feel free to ask any questions you may have in the chat box as they come up. Callan, if you could switch slides. Oh, there we go. So my name is Jordan Blisk. My pronouns are he and him. I'm going to be the primary facilitator of today's COP. I'm a lawyer by trade, and beyond my own personal experiences with legal transition, I've been working to help transgender non-binary individuals through their legal transition since 2016. I was the first out trans student to graduate from the University of Colorado Law School. And in addition to my role here as an identity consultant, I'm also the executive director for the Colorado Name Change Project, as well as the president of the Colorado LGBT Bar Association. Also with us today is the amazing Callan Smith, who is a fellow identity consultant and digital communications manager. Callan, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I work in the digital marketing field, and I'm proud to be able to be part of this initiative as a trans person wanting to ensure that everyone can understand better what legal transition is and how difficult it can be for trans people.
Thank you, Callan. If you could switch slides to the next one, that would be great. Awesome. So before we get underway, as I am a licensed attorney, but only here in the state of Colorado, I'm going to give a quick disclaimer about today's presentation, just to make sure we're all on the same page regarding the context of the information we'll be discussing. So this presentation and its information is intended for educational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice for any particular situation. No attorney-client relationship is formed between the attendees and the presenter of this publication simply by attending this program or referencing its materials. Next slide, please. So today and in our next session, we're going to be covering the basic processes by which transgender and non-binary people change their legal names and gender markers on state and federal. About that, and state and federal identity documents, along with the obstacles that prevent many from accessing legal transition and the benefits that it provides. Then we're going to turn specifically more so in the next session to the role that your organizations and staff may play in this process and discuss strategies for providing supportive gender affirming care to patients who are legally transitioning. By the end of these two communities of practice sessions that we'll be conducting on the topic, you'll be able to define the legal transition process, describe how legal transition intersects with accessing HIV prevention and care services, describe how legal transition intersects with medical transitions, describe the barriers preventing individuals from obtaining identity congruent legal identification, and you'll also be provided with action steps to improve your ability to offer status neutral, gender affirming HIV prevention and care services. Next slide, please. So let's start out by getting some common language together for today, starting with what legal transition means. So when I'm referencing legal transitioning, we're describing a process by which many transgender and non-binary people change their legal names and or gender markers to better align with and represent their gender identity. Broadly speaking, there are three kind of buckets of actions that transgender people take to transition. And those are kind of social, medical, and legal. So social transition often involves things like coming out as transgender, changing aspects of one's appearance, dress, and or behavior, as well as the name or pronouns that one goes by in kind of everyday interactions. Y'all are probably already familiar with medical transition, which often includes things like hormone therapy and a variety of gender confirming surgeries. Ultimately, legal transition is just one more way that transgender people can more authentically express their identities and have them recognized by society. So just like medical transition, not everyone legally transitions, and there's no one size fits all to how to be transgender. But many transgender and non-binary people do choose to change their names and gender markers as a necessary part of their gender transition. Next slide, please. So I would ask y'all to participate with me in a little bit of a thought exercise here and answer this question in the chat, or if you prefer to come off on mute. But when is the last time that you had to show any form of legal identification? What was the context, if to whatever degree you're comfortable sharing? I just want to get some examples out there of what do we need IDs for in our everyday interactions? At the airport, travel and alcohol purchase, doctor's appointment. Whew, we're going faster than I can keep up with here. Entering restaurant, bar, doctor's appointment, matching credit card, pharmacy, at the library, fingerprints for name change, housing application. So like, y'all are on this. I asked, what do you need your ID for? And like, I literally can't even keep up with the chat of how fast you're answering this question, because I think we all get it fundamentally, right? Like IDs are essential. Whether it's something small like buying age-restricted cold medicine at Walgreens, or a huge life moment like getting married. Like the point is that we need our IDs all the time. And what they communicate to society about who we are and their effect on how others interact with us is really important. So this may be not much of a thought experiment for those of you joining us today who are also transgender, but for those who aren't, I want you to try and imagine how you would feel if you woke up tomorrow as the exact same person, but your IDs no longer accurately reflected who you are. Same picture, but different name, different gender marker. It's like, I want to know, and I guess I'd ask for more participation here in the chat. How would that make you feel? If you felt you were one way, but you have this thing that you're going to have to show to other people in society, telling those people that you're somebody else. Lost, unvalidated, betrayal to myself, nervous. Yeah, I think those are all very valid answers. Incongruent. I'd feel crappy. Yeah, no need to put too fine a point on it. Trapped, unable to travel, constant reminder of someone who you don't identify with. Yeah, these are all great answers. So, I think, so my next question would be, would that in any way change how you thought about yourself? If you were told that you were someone else, would that change how you thought about yourself in any way? Would feel as if I didn't exist. I'd lose confidence. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, creates a lot of feelings of anxiety adds an additional layer of difficulty to your moving through society. So it may not change who you know yourself to be, right? Just because you're told, so everyone else tells you you're one thing, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's who you are. And I think we all understand that. But I think we're also, like, a lot of these answers are hinting at the answer to kind of the next leading question that I wanted to ask, which is, would that change how you move through society? A lot of these answers were things like bars and restaurants. Would you feel more nervous going to meet up with a coworker for drinks after work if you didn't have if you had an ID that said you were someone else, or you were worried about an interaction of presenting that type of ID? How would that affect you? Less engagement. Wouldn't change how I thought about myself, but would make me feel like I was being scrutinized or I was lying about who I was. I would be thinking constantly about how I was being perceived and feel like I was on high alert all the time. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so like sometimes it's small things, right? Like it's this anxiety around being able to go out and socialize with friends in certain situations because you're afraid that, someone's going to take a look at the ID, look at the ID, and, maybe that's not where you're getting drinks anymore that day. Maybe it's a bigger thing, like applying for a new job or a new apartment. Sometimes it can be something where it feels life or death, like getting pulled over by police. So I think, all of these answers are getting at, we know that card, what it says about you, isn't really who you are, but in a lot of ways, does that really matter if you're literally and legally seen as someone else? And the point of this thought experiment is to demonstrate this. Lacking access to accurate IDs completely strips the ability for transgender people to decide who, when, and where to come out, or even whether to come out at all. And this has massive downstream effects on individuals' economic stability. And for our purposes today, it also has a very direct effect on access to healthcare. Next slide, please, Kellen. So let's start out with some basic facts and figures on legal transition. In 2015, the National Center for Transgender Equality's United States Transgender Survey, which gathered responses from over 20,000 participants across the country, indicated that 46% of adults who have transitioned had no IDs or records that accurately reflected their gender identity, meaning that their IDs listed an incorrect name, gender, or both. Incongruent IDs create an increased risk for mistreatment and discrimination, as legal IDs are often required to access jobs, housing, healthcare, and other public benefits. Instability in one of these major life areas often has a domino effect on the stability of others. Blatant discrimination as a result of not having proper ID is also rampant and dangerous. Of transgender people who have presented a gender incongruent ID, a third report having negative experiences that included being harassed, denied services, or even attacked. We also can't talk about those figures without noting that the risks can significantly go up from there for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as undocumented residents. Incomplete legal transition has also been found to be associated with higher reported postponement of medical care and use of non-prescribed injections. On the flip side, affirming gender identity through the use of chosen names in multiple contexts is associated with positive health outcomes pretty much across the board, including things like lower depression, suicidal ideation, and suicidal behavior, along with lower negative emotional response to gender-based mistreatment. This research is especially supported in the context of transgender youth, and I have several for all of the things that I just threw out here at the end of this, and y'all will have access to these materials at the end of the session. I have 2 pages of references for all of these things if you want to dig in more on some of these things, and I'm kind of giving you a very quick flyby over. But this research simply supports what we already know. Treating transgender people with dignity, respect, and affirmation has material impacts on the well-being of transgender people. Further, affirmation in legal context puts tangible space between a transgender person and certain risks for harassment or violence. Thinking back to our thought experiment from earlier, though having an affirming ID may not stop you from getting pulled over if you speed by a cop, you may experience discrimination based on another characteristic, such as your race. Handing an ID that matches your gender through the car window removes opportunity for an officer's potential anti-transgender bias to poison that traffic stop. It might not prevent someone from having to educate medical staff about transgender health, but it should at very least prevent them from being dead named in a waiting room. And so in summary, while IDs cannot fully protect transgender people from bias motivated discrimination, accurate IDs can close off the risk for at least some specific types of transphobia or violence and empower transgender people to be recognized more fully for who they truly are. Next slide, please. Ironically, not having an affirming ID can actually create a catch-22 for transgender people seeking to start medical and or legal transitions. As one transgender respondent in a 2020 study noted, quote, "And they tell me, we have to call you what's on your medical records until we get that name changed. And that's what I'm trying to change. That's what my biggest issue is. It's about hormones. It's about name change." I'm going to assume that everyone in this room understands that transgender people have a pretty complicated relationship with the medical system, and it's one that often involves trauma and results in a lot of fear and avoidance. In fact, one study stated that I was in researching for this program. One study found that prior research has demonstrated that significant barriers to adequate healthcare exist for transgender individuals, such that even transgender individuals who have a primary care provider are not necessarily out to them and may be uncomfortable talking about transgender-related healthcare with their providers. Increased risk for tension make it less likely that transgender people lacking affirming IDs will engage with medical providers if they view an interaction as non-essential. While this audience today, to this audience today, HIV prevention and care may be at the forefront of our minds when it comes to health outcomes. Unless transgender people without affirming IDs can feel confident that they won't be outed to everyone in a waiting room when they go to get tested, or worse, then they have to weigh whether that need for care outweighs the risk for discrimination. And unsurprisingly, that calculation often results in many people deferring or even forgoing necessary care altogether. Next slide, please, Kellen. So I'm going to ask for your participation again here in the chat as well. Y'all have been really wonderful with engaging with these questions today. The next one I have for you is what are some of the reasons why you see transgender patients give up on accessing regular HIV prevention care and services? They can be like, I'm kind of looking for like, what are the indirect or like associated barriers that transgender patients encounter in medical transition and HIV prevention and care? Things like, you know, off the top of my head, lack of reliable transportation, affordability of medication, general distrust of medical providers, things kind of like that. I'm looking for what your experiences in this field have been. Providers tell them that they need to stop HRT to get HIV care or be on HIV meds. Emotional burden, having to educate a provider on trans identity. Too many barriers, ID, culturally responsive care, providers using their dead name. Yeah. Language barriers. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Callie, could you move to the next slide for us, please, here? Housing. Yeah. Providers crossing personal boundaries because they're overly curious about trans people. Yes, absolutely. Employment. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a lot of these associated things, you know, that really do have a direct impact on whether somebody is able to access the care that y'all are tasked with providing. It's not just the kind of like direct, obvious answers that we're looking for when we're looking for how do we solve these access gaps. And so let's let me see here. Let's go ahead and refocus our discussion again on the context of legal transition specifically. Having gender affirming IDs is obviously important, and it obviously has material impacts on transgender people's well-being. But when almost half of trans people who have transitioned lack proper IDs, where's the disconnect? So costs, access to, or lack of access to resources and procedural requirements, such as providing documentation of certain medical procedures, are among the main reported barriers preventing transgender people from updating their gender on IDs. So let's start with finances. And to do that, I've got another question. I know I'm asking for a lot here today, but I've got another question for the group. If you have legally transitioned and you're comfortable sharing in the chat, how much did you personally spend on your legal transition? Like all costs associated, start to finish, not like what was the cost? Because I can sit and throw numbers all day, but I want you all to hear from your peers, what the experiences have been in this regard, including medical procedures or just the documentation. Just the documentation, I would say, if we're looking at kind of like medical transition and legal transition as separate buckets, even though there's a lot of interplay there, I would say like legal transition. So fees to update IDs, court fees, certified copies, fingerprint-based background checks, new document request fees, things like that. I'm just starting and it looks like it'll put a dent in my bank. Yeah. Around 600, but birth certificate is still not correct. 1,500. Yeah. 2,400, including HRT, something like that. Yeah. Yeah. It can go quite up there. So there's no average cost for a legal transition because there's no average case. And there are a host of factors that would affect what someone can expect to spend. It depends a ton on your state's process and also various factors such as your age, criminal record, and immigration status. But the short answer is a lot, as I think you can gather from the chat. Generally speaking, you're looking at costs that start at about $200 for like the super cheap end to well over $1,000 depending on your needs. And this is also assuming that you DIY this and do not hire a lawyer to help. If you're a naturalized citizen like myself, you're looking at paying $555 just for a new certificate of citizenship alone. Like literally just one document, $555. Mine is not updated. But even if you're not, several $100s is like the starting entry point for this typically, and that is often an insurmountable amount of money for people who are already coming from an extremely economically disenfranchised community. And this remains probably the single largest factor that prohibit those who want to legally transition from doing so. There are also particularly significant disparities and access barriers that exist for BIPOC individuals, particularly Native, Asian, multiracial, and Black respondents, young adults, students, those with low incomes, and people with disabilities. In fact, over a third of transgender women of color have not changed their name or gender marker due to costs alone. Medical gatekeeping has also been another huge barrier historically, and there is an unsurprising correlation between those who are unable to access desired medical transition resources and those who are unable to access legal transition. This is partially because for a long time, and as is still the case in many states today, surgery has been explicitly mandated as a prerequisite codified into law for updating IDs, such as birth certificates, to have the correct gender marker. So in many areas, the law is catching up to recognize that not all transgender people want or need surgical intervention, but you'll still see vestiges of this medical legal gatekeeping partnership in the requirements for medical providers to sign off that the transitioning patient has had, quote, appropriate clinical treatment. Well, as we'll discuss next session, this is a term that provides more flexibility to providers. It ultimately still enforces a system that distrusts transgender people's ability to determine for themselves how their identity is legally represented. So a personal anecdote here. When I was transitioning myself in Indiana back in 2015, it feels like a lifetime ago, but also like yesterday. I personally just had awful experiences at every possible step of the way. Legal information was confusing, it was inaccessible. The cost to change my name was astronomical compared to my hourly pay rate. And when I finally got to my court hearing, the judge made made me out myself to the courtroom and even question my immigration status while I was serving actively in the Air Force Reserve at the time, making me drive over 3 hours to retrieve proof of citizenship, which as a lawyer, I now recognize was completely unnecessary. It's not required, by the way. On the medical front, I had to drive to the next town over just to even find a doctor who could prescribe me hormone therapy. And every single staff member at her office intentionally misgendered me at every single appointment I had for the entire time that I saw her. When I was finally ready to legally transition, her signature was the last hurdle that I had to clear. But when I went to pick up the form from her office, I noticed that she'd made several careless errors on it. So I had to go through her office again to get a corrected copy. And when I finally managed to get that, it was still wrong. She had marked that I was transitioning to female. I would consider myself not to be very much of a crier and very much of a problem solver, but in that moment, after all of the hoops that I had been made to jump through, it was just beyond discouraging. And all I could do was cry in the parking lot of the Indiana DMV. And if it wouldn't have been for my partner at the time marching back into that doctor's office to demand that she fix the form for the now third time, I probably would have walked away empty-handed. And so my point is this: you can't always point to a single barrier that prevents people from accessing legal transition, just like you can't point to a single barrier that prevents people from accessing HIV prevention and care services. Rather, in both settings, it's often the cumulative totality of the burdens the transgender people face, which tend to snowball into the result of them not getting the services that they need. Kellen, if you could switch to the next slide, please. Oh, I think we duplicated this one. Yeah, I think we duplicated this one here. Sorry about that. Okay, so next one beyond that. Great. Awesome. Well, we are going to keep things relatively short today, and we'll follow up again with part 2 that's going to discuss kind of a little bit more of your roles in the next session. Thank you so much for attending and participating today. I hope that you found this discussion useful, and I'm super excited to follow up with part 2 of the session next month. We're going to be going into more depth on the logistics of legal transition process, the roles your organizations may be asked to play, and how you can best support transgender patients coming to you for HIV prevention and care services. Additionally, in case you might have missed it, I want to also refer you to a related COP that was put on by Andrew Miller just last month on gender affirming electronic healthcare records and forms. You can find that session available on the Denver PTC CBA, that's a lot of letters, supplemental Discord. And I would highly encourage you to check that out. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see you all on March 8th. Oh, wait, actually, sorry, I totally spaced. I wanted to open up, I am so sorry. Thank you, Zami, for reminding me here. I was just rolling on, I wanted to open up before with the remaining time we had left, I want to open up for any questions that y'all might have over the stuff that we covered today.
Hey, Jordan, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So one great presentation. I loved it so much. One of the questions that I have is thinking about the scenario you gave about yourself. What recommendations or suggestions would you or do you have for folks who might be working in the field? If someone comes and they say, you know, I've gone to this provider several times, I keep getting my documentation incorrectly. What would be some recommendations or best practices you would recommend to someone?
Yeah, so I think it kind of depends on the context of where that's going to be. But typically, if you're looking at provider letters, and we'll talk about kind of the role of providers and best practices there next session. I think if you're encountering issues, repeated issues with the provider, it can get complicated if that's like the only provider in the area, like it was for my particular situation. And so, the options that I had were relatively limited. I think for folks who are in a more metro area where there are more options, reaching out, finding out if the healthcare system that your provider is a part of has LGBT care coordinators or patient advocates that can kind of step in and elevate your request if it's not being taken care of appropriately as it should be, which should just be you ask, you get whatever you need signed, assuming that you're that's, again, we'll get into logistics in the next question, but assuming that that's something that you're asking, assuming that you're asking for something that a provider can do. If you're running into issues, I think finding people who can advocate on your behalf is kind of one of the best things that you can do. And also making sure to document to the best of your ability, documenting the interactions that you're having with the provider where you've made those requests. If you kind of have here's the date that I gave this, like the more you can keep that over electronic type communication, that'd be ideal. So then you can kind of take that to said patient coordinator and say, hey, I've made these requests, they're not being handled appropriately. Can you intervene here and help get this escalated appropriately? I think that would be the recommendation that I would have. We got a hand up here. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, my name is Ms. Jai. Thank you for this. This has been super great so far. So I'm really looking forward to session 2. I did have a question. So you mentioned about the medical legal barriers, specifically around surgery as a prerequisite, and how that is still kind of like lingering in some legislation nationally. And I was wondering if you were aware of any organizations that were working to sort of dismantle those components, or any organizations that CBOs could link up with in order to do collaborative work together.
So Lambda Legal is kind of probably the leading organization, and I full disclosure, I interned for them during law school. So there are other folks out there doing this work. They're not the only ones. But Lambda Legal nationally, because we've got folks from all over, a lot of organizations that have been involved in things tend to be more on the state level. And there's so many of those that I could list. Broadly speaking, nationally, Lambda has definitely challenged a lot of these really anti-trans. Like in the last few years, unfortunately, there's been an aggressive anti-trans backlash that's really made things in certain ways more restrictive, or states have attempted to make things more restrictive on trans folks seeking to transition. And so they've really led a lot of the efforts in pushing back on that. They were the ones that represented Dana Zim in the recent Zim v. Pompeo, well, not recent really anymore. I think it started in 2015, I want to say. And the Department of State they just resolved it, I think at the end of last year. So it's been a long process. And then that, sorry, I'm sorry. To clarify for legal speak, the Zim v. Pompeo case was essentially over someone's right to have an X gender marker on their federal passport. And so the answer is yes, and it will be coming soon. It is not yet available, but it will be coming soon. So yeah, Lambda is one that I would definitely suggest if you have folks who are, or if you're in and we'll go over this kind of more in the next session, but if you are in a state where it's extremely restrictive on transgender people obtaining state ID changes, and they're interested in getting involved in a case, potentially to explore their options to change that on a state level, I would definitely suggest linking up with Lambda Legal, reaching out to the ACLU. The transgender, I'm going to tell that it's Transgender Education Legal Defense Fund, I think. TELDEF, I might be butchering their acronym here, but they're a little bit more of an East Coast based organization, but they do a lot of this great work as well. They've won some really great victories, specifically kind of more on the East Coast side of things, but they're both wonderful. Or those are the top 3 organizations I would say to get in touch with if you have folks who are interested in challenging some discriminatory laws.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions?
I do have one more question for
Yeah.
you. So you also mentioned the cost of documentation change. And it's been my experience locally in Arizona and in the Southwest that there aren't really a ton of organizations to provide financial support to folks for document change, for medical transition services. So oftentimes it's the community coming together in a grassroots way and kind of kickstarting each other's gender support. And I was wondering if you were aware of any organizations that do provide financial assistance for document change, specifically like legal name change or gender marker changes, things like that.
Yeah, so it's not as many as I wish that there were. I think over the last few years, it's been really heartening to see how many more resources exist than did when I was transitioning, even like 7 years ago now. Most of those exist on kind of the legal front, where we're meeting the gap in access to legal resources. Financially, it's harder. And there are some things out there. So the organization that I run is actually one for Coloradans. We don't do we currently we don't currently give micro grants to folks outside of our state. I would love to be able to one day. We just don't have the funding to be able to expand beyond Colorado at this point. But there are some grassroots organizations that exist. There are some kind of like local funds that exist. Unfortunately, the financial side of things is really where that big gap is still, I think, most noticeable in preventing folks from accessing this. Yeah, Colorado, if you're in Colorado Name Change Project, we have a microgrant program where we ask folks to fill out an application, and then we can cover, kind of partial or full legal transition process depending on needs and such. But I am not aware of, honestly, any other organization that offers the same type of services to the degree that we do. Unfortunately, even kind of on the national end, I think we're kind of unique in offering that comprehensive level. But there are, I'm completely blanking on the name of one of there is an organization though that provides, it's one of the ones that provides scholarships for like medical transitions as well. And I think they also do one for legal transitions, but the name is escaping me off the top of my head. I wish I had a better answer for that one, but unfortunately, like a lot of that requires the infrastructure of a 501c3 in order to process that a level of money and have that volunteer base to distribute it. And a lot of the resources that exist for folks legally transitioning, like I was mentioning, are on the legal side of things, where they tend to be more like workshops or clinics, or some like in other models, like, pro bono attorney meets trans person, they pair up, they do the name change process. But to establish the funding for it, I think is a little bit bigger of a challenge, unfortunately. But it's something that I definitely want to see. I would love to see more access for. Absolutely. Awesome. Do we have any other questions? All right. Zami, I'm going to pass things back to you then, if there's anything you wanted to add before we wrap up today.
Yes, thank you so much. Again, thank you so much, Jordan and Callan. This was a wonderful presentation. Our COP, we will have part 2 on March 8th. It will be a different time though. So typically we do it 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., but on March 8th for part 2, it'll be 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So please note that in your calendar so that you don't miss out on the dynamic part 2. Thank you all again for coming to this month's COP, our second COP for this month, and your commitment to transgender health and gender affirming care. So thank you all again. If you do need technical assistance, please remember, reach out to me at zami.hemingway@dhha.org. We'll be more than happy to assist you all in building out your gender affirming care work. See you all on the 8th.